Hello and welcome to the Django DRF project, eCommerce. This tutorial is part of a series of tutorials which you can watch for free. The link to the YouTube course playlist is in the video description. This course is also available on Udemy, where you can watch the course ad-free, download the tutorial source code, and access all updated tutorials and playlist. The link to the course, which will always provide the best price, can be found in the video description. In this tutorial, we're going to start building some tests. We're going to start with models. Now, because we are going to require data in order to actually create some of our tests, then we want to do that in the most dynamic way possible. So here we're going to also introduce factories. So factories are a really quick and easy way of creating realistic objects to use in our tests. Back in our project, let's go over to the DRF Commerce folder. Here we have our testing folder that we already have created in the previous tutorial. Now inside of here we have a product folder which we already created, which represents the product app. So all tests that will be found inside of this product folder here will be related to the product app. So let's go ahead and create an init file, just in case we need that. And let's go ahead now and create a new file. So naming files, we want to try and organize our tests so it makes it easy for anyone to be able to access or identify what tests would be found within this module. So let's just call this test models.py. So that clearly identifies that tests found within this module here will be related to models. So let's just remind ourselves what it is that we need to actually do. Now, if you remember, we run the Python coverage tool, and that told us that there are three tests missing here in the models file. And we utilized the HTML. We generated HTML cover folder here, utilizing coverage HTML, a way of reporting. So with coverage, you can report things in all different ways. That's just one output that can be generated. So we generated that, which was a HTML page, and we run that HTML page, index.html, and we saw that in actual fact, within our models, it suggested, where are we? In product models, it suggested that we needed to test the dunder string functions here. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to set up a few different tests to test that. So here we're going to take the approach and create tests utilizing class. And we don't necessarily need to take that approach. Maybe a more simplistic approach would be just to create functions. But I'm going to use classes because in my opinion, it gives us a better structure to our tests within this document. So let's call this, for example, class. Let's test models. Okay. And now let's go ahead and create a function. So our tests will ultimately be functions. So let's call this test underscore. And what we're going to test first, so we just need to identify what we're going to test. So let's test the category model. So category model. Now, is that the best naming for the test? So what we want to try and do is name our test appropriately. Now, we don't necessarily need to worry too much about the length of this function. We just want to make it as friendly as possible for anyone else to be able to come along and be able to identify what this test is actually testing. At least I think that is a good place to start. So test category model isn't necessarily useful at this point. So test category, well, we know we're testing models. So do we need to always mention model? Because at the end of the day, with test models, we know what we're testing models. So here it says test models again. So test category string output. So let's say output string. How about that? Just to give you a few ideas, I mean, you might decide to utilize a pattern like this, for example. So test category, test brand, test product. You might utilize the word model at the end. And that can be important because when you actually run tests, it will give you an indication where tests have failed. So being able to work out exactly where that is, utilizing the word model, you can obviously match that up. So again, that's just a different approach. Now, here I've separated the three tables that we built, the three models, because you may have quite an extensive amount of testing that you might need to do in those individual models. So utilizing classes here in comparison to, say, functions will allow us to kind of create a clear structure of tests and relate them to specific elements or specific things within our application that we're testing. Let's go ahead and build our test. So we're going to create this as a function, and I'm going to call this test string method. I think that's fairly generic. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Okay. So that's our method. So this is the test. This is the test. This represents a test that we're going to now create. So now we need to actually create the test. Typically, and here we are creating a unit test. Typically, we can organize our test in a certain way, and there are many different kind of acronyms that we can utilize here. Probably one of the more common is AAA, which is arrange, act, and assert. So essentially, there are three components here, or three stages of building our test. First is to arrange, and then we go ahead and act, and then we go ahead and assert. So essentially what we're doing is we're gathering all the resources together, mocking up everything that we need. So by doing that, remember, we're gathering all the tools and we're trying to isolate the code so we can test it. That's the important part here. So we're bringing all the resources that we need for the test, and then we go ahead and we act. So we perform an action on the code, utilizing the code that we're testing. And then we go ahead and assert. So essentially what we're doing here is we're testing to make sure that the outcome of the action that we've performed is exactly what's expected. So looking at what's expected here, our dunder string function here, let's remember that this allows us to interact with the data in a way that makes it easy for us to understand what data we have, for example, returned in our query set. So whenever we add a new record and return it in a query, for example, that query in Django is returning in a query set. That query set, if it has returned multiple records from the database, will produce a list of objects, each one of those objects representing a record in the database. Now, to make it easier for us to work with those records, we can supply a name of some sort to it. So it makes it easier for us to identify the different objects, the records that have been returned from the database. So what we're going to need to do here then in our test is that we're going to need some way of actually creating a database, adding some data into the category table, and then performing some sort of action so that we can then test that what is returned from the database is then returned in the database and named appropriately. And obviously the naming scheme here is just using the name of the record. So using the name field of that particular record. So the object should be named the same name as whatever is stored in the name field. Just bear with me a second for those who do understand this. So here in the admin, we created a brand earlier. Now you can see that when the brand has been outlisted from the database, this is a big list of all the brands that we have. We only have one brand here in the database. Here we have the name, brand-1. Just for a second, I'm just going to, you don't need to follow this. I'm just going to remove the dunder string. Just comment that out in the brand here, right? So I've done that in the brand. So I've commented out this dunder string method here. So let's go back to the admin. So back in the admin, I'm just going to refresh. You can now see it says brand object 1. So that's essentially what the dunder string is doing. It's simply just naming. And remember, this is basically run a query and it's returning all the objects from the brand table. There's only one at the moment. And you can see that when it's being returned, it's using the dunder string data, if you like, to actually name the brand. And obviously it makes it easy for us to understand what brand we're working with. Otherwise we get this kind of generic naming, brand object 1, brand object 2, and so on. So if I add a new brand here and save it, it's going to be brand object 2. So let's just reactivate our dunder string method and let's go back to the admin. So now we have the dunder string in place. If I refresh, you can see it then outputs the name. So it's using the name field of the record to then actually output a name here, which makes it easier for us to understand and recognize the data. So hopefully what we understand now is that we're going to need a database in order to actually, or some data to actually unit test our dunder string method. Now, here in the testing environment, we don't use or touch the real database. Whenever we generate a new test or run a new test, the testing environment will create a database, a testing database, which we can then go ahead and populate and use. This testing database will be generated from all the information that we've already created, our models and so on. So it will be a complete replica of our real database, but it will be empty. We will need to actually populate it with data in order potentially to run some of our tests. And now what we could do is we could hard code some information here in the top section, in the arrange section. We could hard code something here to actually kind of make a query set so that we could then run that against our function, our dunder string function. That's one way, but the thing is here that we are probably going to utilize the database or need to add data to the database quite a lot for a lot of tests. So we want a way where we can potentially dynamically, and thinking about dry, don't repeat yourself, thinking about those principles, having a way of generating data in our database in a simple way which we can then utilize for multiple tests. So this is where we start to talk about factories. So instead of manually creating our query set, we're going to utilize a factory, which is going to pre-populate our database before we then go ahead and act and assert. There are two packages that come to mind, Factory Boy and Model Bakery. If you are thinking about utilizing factories in more detail, it's well worth exploring both of these packages when you have a little bit of time. In this course, we're going to be utilizing Factory Boy. So first thing that we need to do is go ahead and actually install Factory Boy. So we're going to need to find and install the package. Because we're utilizing Pytest, my first thought is always to think, has someone developed a package which aids the interaction between Pytest and the tool that I want to install? And it looks like here we do have Pytest Factory Boy. So let's go ahead and actually install this. So this is going to install, looks like Pytest Factory Boy, but behind the scenes it will also install Factory Boy. So we'll probably still have access to the native tools which Factory Boy provides. Okay, so let's go back in, make sure you're in your virtual environment, of course. So let's pip install Pytest Factory Boy. So you can see here that it's installed Factory Boy as well as some other packages, including Faker, which we're going to be utilizing. So that was Pytest Factory Boy. So let's just keep this up to date. Okay, right. So now we have that installed. Let's just go through and build up our environment so we can start to build a factory and then utilize a factory within our test. All right, so let's start off by dropping that down. Right, so in our testing environment, let me just close everything down. Let's get into the right place. Right, so inside of our test folder here, let's go ahead and create a new file. So first of all, we just need to decide whether this piece of code, these features, are related to specific apps or whether they have like maybe a global context. And this factory is probably going to be utilized maybe on multiple apps. So this is why it's on the outer or the root directory of our test folder here, not within a product. But that's a thought process to think about as you start to build in different features and functions. Does it have some localized connection to a app or not? And remember, with these folders here, this product folder is an app. So that will help you decide where this file might need to go. So let's call this factories.py. And then inside of here, let's go ahead and import factory. Okay, right. So we're probably going to need to bring in some models. So what we're trying to do here with Factory Boy is actually generate some data for our model. So we're going to need a model. So let's go ahead and say from DJ, I don't know what I'm talking about, DRF, wrong package, DRF eCommerce. DRF eCommerce. Where are we? Dot product. My brain was in another project there. Product dot models. There we go. So from our models, let's import, and then we're going to start with category, right? But we're going to need all the others anyway. So let's just bring in brand and product as well. Right, so those are all the models that we're going to be working with and populating data for. Now, don't get confused here, because just because we're using the models here from our product app, it doesn't mean that we're going to be utilizing the real database that's generated. We are still going to be utilizing the test database. It's going to be utilizing this metadata to help build that test database. Right, so with that in place, let's go ahead now and build a factory. Right, so what we're going to do here is create a new factory for category. So let's call it category factory. And then what we're doing here is we're utilizing our models. So we're going to utilize that information to help support this process. So here in Factory Boy, we have factory.django tools, and then we can use the Django model factory. And that's going to allow us to easily create a factory for our model. So here we have class meta. So we define the class meta. We define the model that we're using equals category. And now all we need to do is just populate the data. So at this point, we need to know what fields we need to populate. And then we need to describe those fields here so that we populate the correct data. Right, so if we go back into our models, you'll see that obviously we're using an MPTT model, which can ruin the party a little bit, to be honest with you. And so we're going to keep this nice and simple and just have one category. But once you start making a big nested bunch of categories, that's where it can get a little bit complicated utilizing factories. So for now, to keep it nice and simple, all we need to do is think about the name. We just need a name of a category. That's all. So let's bring in name. So here in actual fact, I can just manually type in something. So I can just call this, for example, test category. There we go. So what's going to happen now, every time I need data from the category table, I just call this factory. It's just going to build it for me. And what I can do is I can, for example, specify how many categories I want to build. So I could say, okay, with this factory, let's build 100 records, and it would do that for me utilizing this information here. Obviously, I would end up with 100 categories named test category at this point, so it's not very dynamic, but we can overcome that with some other tools. And we'll introduce those tools at a later point. Let's just keep this simple for now because there's a lot going on here. So here we have our factory for our category. So now we need to actually implement it within our testing environment here. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to activate it so that we can actually access it from within our tests. So for that, we're going to need to register it. So we're going to need to create a new file here in tests. And we're going to call that the conftest.py. There we go. So this file will be initiated or read before any tests are run by Pytest. So what we're going to need to do here is say from Pytest factory boy, we're going to need to import register tool so we can actually register our factory and utilize it within our tests. So from dot, remember this file is local to factories. So from dot, as in this folder that we're currently in, factories. Let's go ahead and import our category factory. Okay, so we've imported it in, we've made it available, and then all we need to do is then register it. And that way, this will now be available. Now, there is a specific way of then accessing this, and I'll tell you that in a second, but essentially what we've done now is we've re-registered our factory. Now, remember, loosely speaking, this file is going to be checked via Pytest before it then fires off any tests. Now, this can be local to your tests folder here, or it can be local to maybe the application. So you can put it inside the product table here. And again, it depends on what this file is providing, what service this is providing and what it's providing to. So if you, for example, only wanted to run certain things when you run the product test, then maybe you would put the comp test file inside the product folder here. Right, so let's utilize this. Now, what's going to happen here? We've registered this category factory. How this is going to be accessed is all lowercase, category, factory, but with a underscore in between. So that's how we're going to actually access this. So we've registered it as category factory capitals, but this is how we're actually going to access this factory in this manner. So let's go back into, close that up, and the models and the factories. Let's go back into our tests. Right, so first of all, we need to actually go ahead and create a new post. So post equals post, actually, we've got to bring it in first, haven't we? So self, and let's bring in, not post, we're chatting about category factory. There we go. So we want to use the category factory. So we access the category factory. And now let's say category equals or data or post or whatever you like, query set or whatever. In order to actually access our new factory, we are going to need to call it in a specific way. So for example, we had category factory with capitals. So what we're going to need to do is all lowercase category underscore factory. So that's how we actually access it. Now, if you were to trace that back, it wouldn't kind of make sense because it doesn't match up to anything. But when we register the category factory, that is how the format and how we're going to actually access that tool, that factory. So what we can now do is say something simple like x equals and then category factory. So we can now access the category factory. So what's going to happen here is that the factory is going to be run just once in this case. And then you've seen already what the factory is going to do. It's going to create a new record, utilize this information to create a new record. So we're just going to have one record. The name is going to be called test category. So as you might imagine, if I were to query this database and return data, then you can imagine the object name would be test category. Or at least that's what it should be, right? So let's test this out to see if it is the case. Right, so now we need to act. So we've mocked up our data, if you like. We've got everything ready. So now we need to act. So what do we need to do? Well, in actual fact, there's kind of a fine line, I guess, in this case, between arrange and act, because it's kind of the same thing here. So we've already, let's just take it out of arrange and let's place it in act. So that's the action that we've taken. And inadvertently, that's created a new entry into the testing database. So now we can assert. So what is assert? An assertion is a Boolean expression. So we are going to create an expression here, which is going to return true or false. So if, for example, it returns true, it's going to indicate that the test was successful. If, for example, the test or the assertion returns false, then we can determine that the test was not successful. So we're going to need to identify some sort of testable logic here. Right, so here we have the data that is generated. So here in X, what we have now is the actual object that's been generated by our factory. So we can now utilize that to assert. So what we're going to do here is say assert, and let's go for X. I don't know why I used X, apologies, dot string. So what we're going to say is the object X that's returned from a database, the dunder string should method. Remember, that's the method that we've defined in our model, essentially, right? So that's our model method. That method here should return the title of the object that's defined in the object, right? So let's say equals, and in our case, the the name is the test category that we set up here. So that's what should be returned. So when we return this object from the database, the dunder string method should return the name of the record. So now we have that in place, we can give it a go. So let's go back into Pytest, give that a go, and you can see here there's one error. So attempted relative import with no known parent package. Right. So we're told where the problem is, or gives us an indication at least. It's in our test.const file. So let's take a look here. So from.factories, import category factory. So it looks like it has a problem there, attempting to import category factory. So let's have a look. Category factory. So maybe some sort of naming issue. Now I just noticed that we don't have a initialized file here. So let's go and add our init file inside the test folder specifically. So new file here. Init. This is going to allow us to the folder act as a module, so we can import how we're trying to import the different resources here. So let's go ahead and try that again. And there we go. So now we have one failed test. And at the moment, that's what we were expected, because it says here, database access not allowed. So by default, we don't have access to the database. We need to specify that within our tests, that the test has specific access to our test database. Now, something that we will be introduced to probably later in this process is something why we selected, in actual fact, Pytest, in that it provides markers. So markers are a way of us essentially, well, they're essentially declarators. So we're able to declarate a function, for example, here, or a test, and that can then offer different functionality. And this is a really powerful feature that we are going to potentially utilize within our testing to maybe declarate or to tag, if you like, different tests. So if there's a specific set of tests that we want to run, and we only want to run those specific set of tests, we could use, for example, markers to mark tests that we want to run in that specific instance, for example. So what we could do here, for example, is we could declarate functions that require access to the database using some of the built-in declarators, one of them being providing access to the Django database. So instead of us actually having to specify that every time we add a new test, we can just kind of blanket our tests here with, I don't want to use the word blanket then. We can set up this mark to be available for all the preceding tests. So Pytest mark, and then I bring in Pytest, Pytest mark.django_db. Okay, so essentially I'm just going to make this available for all of our tests here. Now you notice that comes from Pytest, so we're going to need to import Pytest here so we can access that resource. So yeah, so instead of declarating individual functions, we're just going to bring that in and make that available globally here in these tests. So every test here is probably going to need access to the database, and now we provided that. So let's give that a go. So now we run the test. You can see that we don't have the error anymore because we've provided access to our tests. And you can see we have one passed test. Great. So we can do a bit of sanity check in here, because if we put a Y on the end of here, we now know that is incorrect. So let's go ahead and run that. You can now see that it actually tells us, it gives us information, the fact that it is incorrect, and it helps guide us where exactly the problem might be in this simple case. Now, if we wanted a little bit more control over the test, what we can do is we can specify the actual name. So eventually we may have a factory which generates some sort of random name. So we're not always able to clearly identify what name is going to be generated. So we can, in the test, actually just override the name. So here we're just going to add name equals, and then let's just call this test cat instead. So now let's change the assert to correspond to the name that we're going to be utilizing for this object that we're going to be building. And let's try that again. And you can see we have now passed. So now we can just repeat the same thing again for the brand. Now you notice that the text or the code is already written here, and that's because I forgot to press record, but it's all here. So you can see that I've simply just copied and pasted from category, and I've changed the name. So test string method, so it's got the same name, which isn't necessarily very useful, but you can see it's in a different class here. So here I'm bringing in the brand factory, okay, brand factory, and I've changed the test brand, and you can see that I've then changed the test brand down here. So that's the test, and then in the factories I've just copied and pasted, changed the name to brand factory, and the model is going to be brand, and the name is test brand and not test category. So get that done, and then go into your comp test file, and then just go ahead and bring in your brand factory and register the brand. And once you've done that, you'll see that everything is passed nicely. We've got 2 tests now running. 100% of all the tests have been completed. And you can see that we have 2 passed. So let's move on to the product table. Now, this is where it gets slightly different, because remember that the product table has relationships with these other tables. So what we need to happen whenever we create a new product, we are going to need to have to build a brand and a category as well, although we have set up our system, remembered to have null fields for categories, but let's just ignore that for a second. Let's assume it doesn't. So we are going to have to build a brand and a category before we can build a product. So we're going to need to take that into consideration. So let's go ahead and build our product factory. Let's just copy this in. And then bring in our class. I may as well just copy it all. So the brand is going to be product, and then we do have a name. So I think it's called title though, isn't it? Rather than name. Let's just double check. So inside the product in the models, let's bring this over to the side. A bit of split screen so we can see our models, because we're going to need to know all the different fields. So here, just going to close that one. So back in our factories, we do have a name. So let's just call this test product for now. Then we're going to need a description. So we're just going to follow. I'm just going to follow what we have set out here in the fields. So description. What's going on here? Oh, the indentation. That's not a problem, I don't think. So name. What's next? Description is digital. So let's set that to true. And we have the brand and then the category. So what we're going to need to do here, like I said, is we're going to need to initiate a new brand and a new category in order to associate and to build a product, because of the referential integrity, because of the relationship that we have built in our database between the product table and the brand and category table. So for this, we simply need to use a equals, a factory. We're just telling factory boy to use another factory. So a subfactory. So this is going to be the brand factory. So what's going to happen here is that before we then generate this product, we're going to initiate and actually generate a brand. And then we do the same thing for the category as well. So factory dot factory even, and then category factory. There we go. Right. So we just close that so we can see what's going on here. It looks like there's an issue there. 1 second. So just a little bit of an issue here with the indentation. Not a problem. So just make sure you've indented it correctly. So there was a space here incorrectly placed. So this is our factory now. So let's go back into the comp test file. Let's go ahead and just register this. Our product factory, and then register the product factory. And now we can utilize it within our tests. So back in our tests, let's go ahead and just copy and paste what we had previously. And this time we're going to be utilizing the the product factory and object product factory. So we could specify the name, so test product, although it's probably the same, but let's be explicit with this. Put it there, and let's give this a go. There we go. So we now have 3 tests that have passed. Let's just try that for a little bit of sanity, whether that works. You can see we have failed. So it looks like it's working okay. And there we have 3 tests. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go back to Pytest coverage and take a look. If we have a look now, you notice that our missing tests have now disappeared. So where they were in the products model here, you can now see that they have been removed because we have tested those functions, and we're currently on this 100% tested application. Now, obviously, that isn't necessarily an indication of the tests that we should now create. There are other tests that we can build, and we will now go ahead and start to think about some of the end-to-end tests that we can generate. And those are going to be the tests where we can generate or test the endpoints. So what you're looking at here is essentially unit tests. So the unit is the function that we've been testing within the model. So we've tried to isolate this function as best as possible, and we've mocked or we've created some data, and then we've tested this function individually.